On a January morning in 1607, the people of southwest Britain awoke to what seemed like any other winter's day. The skies were gray, the air damp, and the tide rolled in along the Bristol Channel as it always had. But by the time the sun had risen higher, the land itself was changed. A wall of water surged inland with terrifying force, drowning fields, sweeping away homes, and leaving towns and villages underwater. This disaster would later be remembered as the Great Flood of 1607, one of the most catastrophic natural events in British history. The floodwaters stretched for miles, turning farmland into sea, silencing churches, and leaving thousands homeless. Tonight, in Boring History for Sleep, we will drift calmly back to that day, exploring what people saw, how they explained it, and what traces of the flood still linger in memory. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can return for more gentle journeys into the overlooked corners of history. The morning of January 30th, 1607 began much like countless other winter days across the lowlands of southwest Britain. In the counties of Somerset, Monmouthshire, and Gloucestershire, the air was damp and chill, the kind of cold that seeps into bones but does not bite sharply. Farmers rose early, as they always did, to tend to livestock or check on stores of hay. Smoke rose lazily from cottage chimneys, mingling with mist that hung low over the fields. In villages along the Bristol Channel, life moved with the steady rhythm of tide and season in one expected disaster. The sea was familiar, sometimes rough, but always part of the landscape. Tides had come and gone for centuries, bringing both danger and prosperity. Fishermen knew the patterns, farmers read the winds, and priests prayed against tempests. Yet this day offered no early warning. There was no sudden storm, no thunder of rain, only the sound of the tide creeping inland, steady as ever. Then, in what seemed like an instant, everything changed. According to witnesses, a mighty wall of water appeared, rushing up the channel with terrifying force. Some described it as a wave higher than a man, racing faster than a horse could run. Others said it seemed to rise from the sea itself, swallowing ships, smashing against riverbanks, and pushing inland with unstoppable power. Cottages that had stood for generations crumbled in moments. Churches were flooded, their pews and altars swallowed by rushing water. Entire herds of cattle were swept away, their cries lost in the roar. Families who had begun the day in quiet routine found themselves clinging to rafters or fleeing toward higher ground. The flood struck with a suddenness that left little chance for preparation. The landscape transformed before people's eyes. Meadows became lakes, roads turned to rivers, and familiar boundaries vanished beneath the water. Some accounts say the flood stretched inland for more than 10 miles, covering over 200 square miles of countryside. Villages like Kingston Seymour, Huntsville, and Burnham lay submerged, their houses either collapsed or standing like islands amid the flood. Monmouthshire fared no better. Here too, farms, mills, and cottages were torn apart. For those who survived, the memory of that morning was etched forever. Chroniclers recorded tales of families swept away in their beds, of churches filled with water up to their windows, of animals found drowned by the hundreds. The devastation was so great that contemporary writers compared it to the biblical flood of Noah, seeing in it not merely a natural disaster, but a sign of divine wrath. The silence after the wave was as haunting as the roar itself. Where once fields had stretched green and fertile, there lay only brown water, littered with debris, timbers of houses, broken carts, thatch from roofs, and the bodies of animals. Survivors gathered on higher ground, shivering in the cold, staring out at the vastness of the water that had consumed their world. What made the Great Flood of 1607 especially terrifying was its unfamiliarity. Floods were known in Britain. Rivers sometimes swelled, storms sometimes battered coasts. But this was something different. The sheer scale of water, the distance it reached inland, and the speed with which it arrived stunned communities. It was not just a flood. It was as though the sea itself had risen to reclaim the land. Some sought explanations immediately. Priests preached that the flood was punishment for sin, a divine warning to repent. Farmers speculated about unusual tides, while sailors whispered of storms far out at sea that had sent waves surging inland. Centuries later, scholars would debate whether the flood was caused by a storm surge, a tidal bore, or even a distant tsunami. But on that January morning, explanations mattered little. What mattered was survival. As the waters settled, the true scale of loss became clear. Contemporary reports suggest that around 2,000 people died, though exact numbers remain uncertain. Entire families were wiped out, their names disappearing from parish records in a single day. Thousands more lost their homes, their livestock, and their means of livelihood. The flood was not just a natural event. It was a social and economic catastrophe that reshaped the region for years to come. And yet, amid tragedy, stories of survival also emerged. Some villagers escaped by clambering onto rooftops, where they waited for hours until boats came. Others saved neighbors by pulling them through windows as water surged. In one account, a farmer's wife floated for miles on the roof of her barn, eventually rescued downstream. These tales, preserved in chronicles and parish records, offered moments of hope against the overwhelming darkness by nightfall, as survivors gathered in churches or on dry hills. The shock of the morning gave way to grief. The great flood had transformed the landscape in hours, leaving scars that would endure for generations. For those who lived through it, that day would never be forgotten. Thus, the morning of January 30th, 1607 stands as one of the most devastating dawns in British history. It began in silence and ended in ruin, reminding all who survived of the sea's unpredictable power. When a disaster as sudden and vast as the Great Flood of 1607 struck, it left not only ruined houses and drowned fields, but also words, accounts written by those who lived through it, or by those who gathered the stories of survivors. These records, scattered across parish registers, pamphlets, chronicles, and private diaries, form one of the richest parts of our understanding. They preserve the shock, the grief, and the bewilderment of communities who saw their world swallowed by water. The earliest and most vivid records come from church parishes. In villages across Somerset and Monmouthshire, clerks dutifully wrote the names of the dead, often with notes indicating the cause. Mort by water, some registers say. In others, whole families appear, their entries clustered together in January 1607. To read these pages is to glimpse the human toll in stark numbers, but also in silences, families with no survivors left to carry their names forward. Pamphlets, widely printed in London and elsewhere, spread news of the flood across the kingdom. One titled A True Report of the Great Overflowing of Waters described the wave as a mighty wall, sudden and most violent, bearing down all before it. Such pamphlets combined eyewitness detail with moral reflection. They reported drowned cattle, ruined churches, and the loss of children, but they also framed the event as divine punishment or warning. In an age when disasters were seldom seen as random, the flood became both news and sermon. Chroniclers, often writing from afar, collected accounts to weave into broader narratives. They described a roaring and swelling of waters in the Bristol Channel, noting how ships were dashed against banks and villages swallowed whole. While less immediate than parish records, these chronicles reveal how the flood entered the memory of the nation. It was not just a local calamity, but a disaster large enough to command attention in the annals of Britain. Eyewitness testimonies add a haunting intimacy. Some villagers recalled waking to the sound of roaring water, as though the sea had risen upon the land. Others spoke of fleeing with children in their arms, climbing to upper floors or scrambling onto roofs. One account tells of a family trapped in their cottage, water swirling waist-high, until the walls gave way and they were swept into the fields. Another describes cattle carried for miles, their bodies later found lodged in trees. These details, simple and direct, preserve the raw terror of the day. A few survivors left personal reflections and diaries. These were not widely published, but remained in family papers, later uncovered by historians. They tell of nights spent without fire, food spoiled by salt water, and neighbors missing at morning. They speak of grief at the loss of children or gratitude for survival against the odds. In these private words, the flood becomes not only a public catastrophe, but a deeply personal wound. Some records dwell on the strangeness of the flood. Witnesses described water rising with unnatural speed, faster than any tide. They noted that skies were calm, with no storm to explain the surge. They wrote of fish stranded in meadows, of boats lifted into trees, of barns floating away intact. These observations, while puzzling to contemporaries, now give modern historians clues as to the nature of the disaster, whether it was storm surge, tidal bore, or even tsunami. In Monmouthshire, one pamphlet preserved a striking image: people clinging to church towers, praying aloud as the water lapped at the stones. The church, often the most solid building in a village, became the last refuge. Some survived in this way, their lives saved by the strength of masonry. Others did not. In one parish, 30 bodies were later found in the nave, drowned where they had sought safety. Such accounts reveal not only the force of the water, but the desperate search for sanctuary. Records also note the aftermath. In the weeks following the flood, parishes held mass burials. Survivors described the grim task of gathering bodies from fields and hedges, sometimes days after the waters receded. The stench of decay mixed with the smell of salt and mud. Families who had lost homes built makeshift shelters of timber and thatch, living among the ruins. Clergy recorded special days of fasting and prayer, calling on God for mercy. These witness accounts, though written in the style of their time, carry a timeless quality. They speak across centuries of shock, loss, and resilience. They remind us that behind the statistics of 200 square miles flooded or 2,000 lives lost were individual voices, mothers calling for children, farmers watching their herds vanish, priests struggling to comfort their flocks. What gives these records enduring power is not only their detail, but their perspective. They reveal how ordinary people in 1607 understood their world. To them, the flood was not merely physical. It was moral, spiritual, and cosmic. It was a sign as well as a tragedy, a story to be told and retold. And because they told it, in registers, pamphlets, chronicles, and diaries, we can still hear their voices today. Thus, the Great Flood of 1607 survives not only in geography, but in words. The water receded, but the accounts remained, preserved by ink and memory. Through them, we glimpse not only what happened, but how it was felt. And in those feelings, fear, grief, awe, we find the true legacy of that morning when Britain seemed to be swallowed by the sea. When the waters of the Great Flood of 1607 receded, they left behind a landscape scarred and a population bewildered. Survivors faced not only ruined homes and drowned fields, but also a profound question: what had caused such a disaster? In an age without meteorology, without seismology, and without modern science, explanations came from faith, memory, and speculation. Over time, new theories emerged, some practical, some imaginative, and some, centuries later, informed by scientific inquiry. To trace these explanations is to follow the path of human effort to make sense of the inexplicable. In 1607 itself, the dominant explanation was religious. Clergy across the flooded regions preached sermons interpreting the event as divine punishment. Pamphlets described it as God's wrath upon sinful communities, likening it to the flood of Noah's time. Some saw it as a warning against greed, others against pride, and still others against neglect of worship. For villagers who had lost children, homes, or herds, these explanations offered meaning, even if they did not soften grief. Faith was not only belief, it was a framework through which disaster could be understood. Alongside this interpretation, more practical voices sought natural causes. Sailors noted that tides had been unusually high, swollen by recent lunar patterns. Farmers observed that winds from the Atlantic had been strong in the days before. Chroniclers speculated about storm surges, waves driven by gales into the funnel-shaped Bristol Channel, where water could rise with deadly speed. Such explanations, though lacking scientific vocabulary, show an intuitive grasp of geography and weather. The people of 1607 did not dismiss nature. They wrestled with it, blending observation with tradition. Some witnesses remarked upon the uncanny speed and force of the water. To them, it seemed not like a tide, but like a wave, higher than a house, moving too swiftly to be natural. Centuries later, these descriptions would inspire another theory, that the flood was caused not by storm surge, but by tsunami. In the late 20th century, geologists revisited the event, noting similarities between accounts of 1607 and those of known tsunamis. They asked whether a submarine landslide or even a distant earthquake might have sent waves racing toward Britain's shores. The idea remains debated, but it reveals how memory and science can combine to inspire new interpretations. Others have pointed to the unique shape of the Bristol Channel. Its funnel-like form, narrowing as it pushes inland, can amplify tides dramatically. Modern scientists know it to be one of the most tidal regions in the world. A storm surge, if timed with a high spring tide, could have raised waters to extraordinary levels. Contemporary records of the floodwaters reaching more than 10 miles inland suggest that amplification played a key role. Thus, geography itself may have conspired with weather to produce the disaster. Still, other theories draw upon climate. The early 17th century was part of the Little Ice Age, a period of colder and more erratic weather across Europe. Harsh winters, sudden storms, and unusual patterns were common. The flood of 1607 may have been one expression of this broader climatic instability. In this sense, the event was not isolated but part of a wider story of nature's volatility. For contemporaries, however, explanations remained closer to home. Some blamed neglect of sea walls and dikes, accusing local authorities of failing to maintain defenses. Others suspected divine judgment for specific sins, such as Sabbath breaking or corruption. A few stories even hinted at supernatural causes, whispers of witches calling the waters, or omens seen in the skies beforehand. These explanations, though varied, reveal a society grappling with limited knowledge and searching for meaning in a time of crisis. What unites all these theories, old and new, is the human need to understand. Whether through faith, observation, or science, people could not accept the flood as mere chance. To label it punishment, to call it storm surge, to study it as tsunami, each is an attempt to bring chaos into order, to transform terror into narrative. The Great Flood of 1607 thus lives not only in records of damage, but in centuries of debate. Its explanations reflect the evolution of human thought, from divine wrath to natural forces, from folklore to geology. And in each theory, we glimpse the same desire, to make sense of water that rose too swiftly, too high, and too mercilessly to be forgotten. When we speak of the Great Flood of 1607, it is tempting to think first of landscapes, fields drowned, churches ruined, rivers and seas merging into one. Yet the truest measure of the disaster is not the water that surged across 200 square miles, nor the walls and dikes that failed to hold it back. It is the people, the men, women, and children who lived along the coasts of Somerset, Monmouthshire, and Gloucestershire, who woke to an ordinary January morning and by afternoon found their lives overturned. The human cost of the flood can never be calculated with precision, but contemporary accounts suggest that around 2,000 lives were lost. For the early 17th century, this was a staggering toll, a devastation comparable to war or plague. In villages where populations numbered only a few hundred, the loss of dozens in a single morning was catastrophic. Parish registers bear silent witness. Whole families entered within days of one another, some with marginal notes indicating perished in the flood. These entries, still visible centuries later, tell of grief that was sudden, overwhelming, and shared. The dead came from every walk of life. Farmers drowned in their barns, shepherds on the hillsides, priests in their churches. Children were swept from their beds, elderly folk from their hearths. Livestock, too, perished in enormous numbers. And while animals are not counted in the same way, their loss was deeply felt, for they were companions, providers of milk and wool, and the foundation of livelihood. The flood was indiscriminate, claiming the strong and weak alike, leaving no class untouched. Yet beyond the dead, there were the survivors, the thousands left homeless, hungry, and destitute. Imagine the scene: whole families shivering on higher ground, watching as the waters slowly withdrew, revealing wreckage where homes had once stood. Their belongings were lost, their fields salted by seawater, their stores of grain spoiled. With winter still gripping the land, they faced not only grief but the pressing question of how to endure the weeks ahead. For many, survival meant dependence. Churches became centers of refuge, offering food and shelter to those displaced. Wealthier landowners sometimes provided aid, though their own losses were severe. Collections were taken across the kingdom, with appeals made in London for donations to the flooded counties. These charitable efforts remind us that even in tragedy, communities sought to help one another, yet the need was far greater than the relief. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors described nightmares of rising waters, the sound of rushing waves haunting their sleep. Parents who had lost children found daily life hollowed by grief. Villages where dozens had perished carried a collective sorrow that endured for years. Oral traditions passed these memories onward, ensuring that even generations later, the flood was spoken of not merely as history, but as trauma. The social fabric of the region was also torn. Families displaced by the flood sometimes migrated, abandoning ruined farms for towns or for work elsewhere. This movement fractured communities that had existed for centuries, altering patterns of landholding and labor. In some villages, population never fully recovered, leaving scars visible even in demographic records today. The flood reshaped relationships between rich and poor, too. While all suffered losses, the poor bore them most heavily. Wealthier households could sometimes rebuild, purchasing materials and hiring labor. The poor, by contrast, had nothing to fall back on. Many were reduced to begging, swelling the numbers of vagrants that already troubled local authorities. In this sense, the flood deepened inequalities, pressing those on the margins further toward desperation at the same time. Moments of solidarity stood out. Accounts speak of neighbors pulling one another from windows, of farmers rescuing children on horseback, of women sharing the last of their bread with families who had lost all. These stories, though scattered, show how disaster can bring not only despair, but also remarkable courage and generosity. They remind us that the human cost is measured not only in lives lost, but in lives saved by the compassion of others. Cultural responses also reveal the depth of impact. Pamphlets and sermons memorialize the dead, framing their loss as both tragedy and warning. Ballads were sung of families swept away, of villages drowned, of churches half submerged. These cultural echoes ensured that the human suffering of 1607 was not forgotten, but woven into the collective memory of Britain. The flood's toll extended into the next generation. Children who survived grew up with stories of the day the sea came inland, shaping their sense of vulnerability. Farmers rebuilt fields only to find them salted and infertile, their livelihoods altered for years. Inheritance patterns shifted as heirs perished, leaving property to distant relatives or even reverting to the crown. Thus, the human cost rippled outward in ways both immediate and long-lasting. What makes the Great Flood of 1607 especially poignant is the intimacy of its records. Unlike many disasters of earlier centuries, it left a paper trail, parish registers, pamphlets, chronicles that allow us to see faces and names. We can trace the stories of specific villages, sometimes even specific households, piecing together the lived experience of catastrophe. Through these fragments, the statistics dissolve into humanity. The human cost of the flood was therefore not only in numbers, but in the reshaping of lives. It was in the empty seats in churches, the abandoned cottages, the salted fields, the families who never returned. It was in the grief of mothers, the silence of children, the weary resilience of farmers who began again with nothing. And it is in memory that the cost endures. The Great Flood of 1607 is remembered today not for its mechanics, whether storm surge or tsunami, but for its human impact, for the lives lost, the communities shattered, and the resilience shown in the face of overwhelming waters. That is its true legacy, the measure of what it meant when Britain was, for a time, underwater. The Great Flood of 1607 was more than a sudden surge of water. It was an economic catastrophe. When the waves receded, they left behind not only broken houses and drowned cattle, but also ruined fields, spoiled stores, and communities facing years of hardship. To measure the impact of the flood is to see how a single day's disaster reshaped the livelihoods of thousands, altering trade, agriculture, and the very balance of survival in early 17th century Britain. Agriculture was the backbone of the affected regions, and it was here that the damage was most severe. The floodwaters covered more than 200 square miles, much of it fertile farmland. Salt water from the sea swept across meadows and fields, killing crops and poisoning soil. Barley, oats, and wheat that had been stored for winter were destroyed in barns, either soaked beyond use or swept away entirely. In some villages, hayricks, so vital for feeding livestock, floated like rafts before dissolving into sodden heaps. The immediate loss was devastating, but the long-term effect was worse. Salt left in the soil rendered land infertile for seasons to come. Farmers who had once lived securely suddenly faced years of reduced harvests. Livestock losses compounded the crisis. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses perished by the thousands, drowned in stalls or swept away in fields. Contemporary pamphlets speak of carcasses littering the landscape, a grim reminder of wealth lost. For farming families, animals were not only food, but capital. A cow represented milk, butter, and calves. A horse was essential for plowing and transport. Sheep gave wool as well as meat. To lose them was to lose the foundation of livelihood. Recovery could not be swift. Rebuilding herds required time, money, and pasture that was now ruined. The fishing trade, too, suffered. Boats were smashed against riverbanks, nets lost, harbors choked with debris. Fishermen who survived found little solace, for the same waters that had fed them had turned destructive. Some rivers, once reliable for salmon or eels, became clogged with silt after the flood, reducing yields for years. Coastal communities that had long relied on a balance of farming and fishing found both pillars weakened at once. Economically, the flood sent shockwaves through local markets. Grain prices soared as supplies dwindled, and what little remained was hoarded or sold at inflated rates. In towns, bakers struggled to keep ovens lit, while poorer families went hungry. Parish records describe riots and quarrels over bread, echoing the unrest seen in later famines. Livestock prices rose sharply, too, as surviving animals became precious. For ordinary people, the flood meant not only grief, but a relentless rise in the cost of living. Trade routes were disrupted as well. Roads, bridges, and fords lay underwater or were washed away, cutting off villages from one another. The Severn estuary, a crucial artery for commerce, became treacherous. Ships that had once carried goods inland faced damaged harbors and altered currents. Merchants complained of delays, while markets that depended on coastal transport struggled. What was once a thriving channel of exchange now became a symbol of uncertainty. The economic impact extended beyond the flooded counties. London and other cities heard quickly of the disaster through printed pamphlets, and collections were organized to send relief. Donations came, but they could not replace lost harvests or drowned herds. Meanwhile, the loss of exports, wool, grain, and fish affected broader markets, reducing trade revenues for the crown itself. In this way, the flood reminded rulers that local disasters could ripple outward into national concerns. Agricultural recovery was slow and uneven. Some farmers experimented with new crops less sensitive to salt, while others abandoned ruined fields altogether. Orchards suffered particularly, for apple and pear trees could not survive prolonged immersion. Vineyards, modest but significant in some areas, were destroyed. Families that had built their lives around generations of farming suddenly faced choices to rebuild, to adapt, or to leave. Migration followed, as some sought work in towns or with relatives elsewhere. The Crown and local authorities faced immense pressure. Landlords, who relied on tenant rents, often found payments impossible to collect. Some remitted dues temporarily, while others pressed their tenants regardless, deepening resentment. Parish relief funds were strained beyond measure, forcing communities to rely on external charity. This widened the gap between rich and poor, for wealthier landowners could cushion losses, while smallholders and laborers slid into poverty. Long term, the flood altered patterns of landholding. Some ruined farms were consolidated into larger estates as desperate families sold or abandoned their plots. Wealthier landlords expanded their holdings, while the poor became wage laborers. Thus, the flood not only destroyed crops, but reshaped the social landscape of rural Britain. Beyond economics, there was a psychological cost tied to livelihood. Farmers who had prided themselves on self-sufficiency found themselves dependent on charity. Merchants who had prospered from coastal trade saw their fortunes decline. A sense of vulnerability spread, for if the sea could so easily undo centuries of labor, what security could anyone claim? The memory of the flood haunted future generations, shaping attitudes toward risk, resilience, and providence. In the longer perspective, the Great Flood of 1607 became a lesson in the fragility of economies tied so closely to nature. It underscored how quickly prosperity could collapse, how a single surge of water could erase years of toil. Later governments, recalling such disasters, encouraged better sea defenses and more careful management of grain reserves. Farmers, too, carried forward the knowledge, investing in stronger barns, higher dikes, and more varied crops where possible. Thus, the economic and agricultural impact of the flood was both immediate and enduring. It was felt in empty markets, in salted fields, in abandoned cottages, and in the reshaping of rural society. It revealed the delicate balance of early modern life, a balance so easily tipped by forces beyond human control. And it left behind a legacy not only of loss but of adaptation, as communities rebuilt upon the ruins of disaster. The Great Flood of 1607 was not only a natural disaster that reshaped landscapes and ruined harvests. It was also a social and cultural event that left deep marks on the communities it struck. To understand its full significance, we must look beyond drowned fields and broken cottages and into the lives, beliefs, and traditions of the people who lived through it. For while the water receded in days, the memory of the flood lingered in society, echoing through sermons, pamphlets, folklore, and even the structures of community life for generations. The immediate social consequences were felt in the disruption of daily life. Villages that had long been stable communities suddenly found themselves scattered. Families displaced by the flood sought refuge with neighbors, in churches, or even in entirely new settlements. Some never returned to their former homes, leaving gaps in the fabric of parish life. In regions like Somerset and Monmouthshire, where many villages lost dozens of inhabitants, the demographic impact was profound. Parish registers show sharp spikes in deaths in early 1607, followed by dips in baptisms and marriages, a sign that social rhythms had been broken. The flood also altered social relationships between rich and poor. While all classes suffered losses, the poor were far less able to recover. Wealthier landowners could rebuild homes, purchase livestock, and absorb economic shocks. For smallholders, laborers, and tenants, the flood often meant ruin. Many were forced into dependence, either upon landlords, charitable neighbors, or parish relief. This deepened social divisions, making inequality more visible and, in some places, more bitter. Relief efforts organized by the Crown and by the Church tried to soften these disparities, but the reality remained. Disasters fell hardest on those with the fewest resources. Communal solidarity, however, did emerge. In villages where people had shared the trauma of the flood, neighbors often pooled resources, living together in surviving houses or helping one another rebuild. Stories survive of communities gathering to bury the dead, repair dikes, and replant fields as a collective act. These moments of unity strengthened bonds, even as grief threatened to fracture them. The flood thus both tested and revealed the resilience of local society. Cultural consequences can be seen most clearly in the way the flood was remembered and narrated. Sermons preached in the aftermath interpreted the event as divine judgment. Preachers compared it to the flood of Noah, urging repentance and moral reform. Pamphlets circulated in London framed the flood as a warning to the kingdom at large, not just the drowned counties. In this way, the flood became a cultural text, a story with meaning beyond the event itself. For 17th century audiences, disasters were seldom random. They were signs to be read, lessons to be learned. The flood entered folklore, too. In villages along the Severn and the Bristol Channel, stories were told for generations about the day the sea rose to swallow the land. Tales of families surviving by floating on rooftops, of animals carried inland for miles, of churches standing like islands in the water, became part of local tradition. These stories, passed from parent to child, ensured that the memory of 1607 endured long after written records faded. They also served as warnings, reminders of the sea's power and of the need for vigilance against future floods. Artistic and literary culture reflected the event as well. Ballads were composed, sung in taverns and markets, recounting the terror of the flood in verse that ordinary people could remember. Some of these ballads survive, their rhymes blunt but powerful, capturing the sorrow and awe of those who had seen the waters rise. Printed pamphlets, meanwhile, combined eyewitness reports with moral commentary, shaping how distant readers understood the disaster. These publications spread the story far beyond the flooded counties, embedding it into the national consciousness. Architecture and landscape also carried cultural consequences. Surviving churches sometimes bore marks of the flood, with lines of water damage visible on walls long afterward. Memorials were erected in certain parishes, recording the event for future generations. In some villages, dikes and embankments were rebuilt higher, reshaping the physical environment as a cultural response to memory. The landscape itself became a living record of the flood, its scars reminders of both vulnerability and resilience. The flood also influenced ideas about community and divine order. For many, it reinforced the belief that society was fragile, dependent on the favor of nature and God. It encouraged humility, repentance, and a sense of collective dependence. At the same time, it stirred debates about responsibility. Were local officials negligent in maintaining sea defenses? Could the crown have done more to prevent suffering? Such questions reveal an emerging awareness of social accountability in the face of disaster in broader cultural terms. The Great Flood of 1607 contributed to the way early modern Britain understood disaster itself. It became part of a pattern of collective memory that included plagues, famines, and fires. Each event was narrated, moralized, and woven into a tapestry of lessons. In this tapestry, the flood stood as a reminder of water's dual nature, life-giving in rivers and rains, but deadly when unleashed in fury for the survivors. The cultural consequence was most intimate, memory carried in families. Children grew up hearing how their parents or grandparents had endured that terrible January. The stories shaped identity, grounding communities in a shared past of suffering and survival. To this day, local traditions in parts of Somerset and Wales still recall the Great Flood, showing how cultural memory outlasts centuries. Thus, the social and cultural consequences of the Great Flood of 1607 were as enduring as its economic ones. They reshaped communities, deepened social divisions, inspired solidarity, and entered the collective imagination of Britain. The flood was more than water. It was a story, retold and reinterpreted across generations, carrying with it both sorrow and strength. When the waters of the Great Flood of 1607 finally retreated, they left behind not only devastation, but also urgent questions of survival. Whole villages lay in ruin, homes reduced to piles of timbers, barns to scattered thatch. Thousands were left homeless, shivering in the damp cold of January. Fields were salted, livestock drowned, and food stores spoiled. For the survivors, the flood was not a single day's catastrophe, but the beginning of months, even years, of hardship. How did they endure? What relief did they receive? And how did the wider kingdom respond to one of the most destructive natural disasters in early modern Britain? The first and most immediate response came from neighbors and communities themselves. In villages where houses had been swept away, those whose homes still stood took in the displaced. Families crammed into cottages, sleeping 2 or 3 to a bed, pooling food, and sharing fires. Parish churches, often the largest and most solid buildings, became places of refuge. Survivors huddled in naves and chancels, sheltered by stone walls that had resisted the floodwaters. These communal acts of care were not optional. They were the only way to endure in the days following the disaster. Clergy played a central role in the response. Priests comforted the grieving, led mass burials, and organized collections for the destitute. Sermons framed the flood as a divine warning, but also urged charity, reminding the living that to care for neighbors was a sacred duty. Some parishes established special funds for flood victims, a burden carried by wealthier parishioners. These funds provided food, clothing, or small sums of money, easing the worst hunger. Local authorities struggled to cope. In counties like Somerset and Monmouthshire, officials recorded the disaster and appealed to the Crown for aid. Justices of the peace oversaw relief distribution, while constables coordinated the rebuilding of dikes and roads. But resources were thin. County coffers, never large, could not stretch far enough to repair the scale of damage. In many places, it fell to landlords to take responsibility for tenants, waiving rents, supplying seed for spring, or providing timber for reconstruction. Yet not all landlords were generous. Some pressed tenants for dues despite their losses, deepening resentment. The Crown itself could not ignore the flood. News traveled quickly through pamphlets and letters, reaching London within days. Accounts of drowned families, ruined farms, and churches filled with corpses stirred both sympathy and alarm. King James I's government authorized collections across the realm, ordering parishes to gather donations for the afflicted regions. These national appeals reflected the seriousness of the disaster. It was understood not as a local misfortune, but as a calamity of national scale. Collections were taken in churches across England, where sermons urged congregations to give generously. Money, clothing, and food were gathered, then sent to county authorities for distribution. Records suggest that significant sums were raised, though the needs of survivors always exceeded the aid. Still, this effort marked one of the earliest examples of national disaster relief in Britain, showing a growing sense that local tragedies required collective response. Charitable institutions, too, played a role. Monasteries had been dissolved decades earlier, but almshouses and charitable guilds stepped in to provide food and shelter. Wealthy merchants and nobles contributed funds, some out of piety, others out of a desire to display generosity. Relief was uneven, often reaching some communities more quickly than others, but it offered hope amid despair. Survivors themselves displayed remarkable ingenuity. With fields ruined by salt water, they sought alternative ways to live. Some fished the flooded meadows, catching eels and salmon stranded by the waters. Others scavenged timber from wrecked barns to rebuild makeshift shelters. Women stretched what food remained, boiling roots, bark, or weeds to make thin soups. Children gathered driftwood and debris for fires. Every small act was part of the larger effort to endure until spring. Rebuilding was slow. Dikes and embankments had to be repaired, often by communal labor. Villagers turned out with spades, shovels, and carts, patching breaches in seawalls. In some areas, new embankments were raised higher, lessons learned from the flood's devastation. Roads and bridges also required repair, for the flood had washed away fords and weakened structures. These efforts consumed months, drawing on both local labor and outside funds. The memory of relief was mixed. Some survivors recalled generosity, neighbors sharing food, strangers sending money, priests offering comfort. Others remembered neglect, landlords pressing rents, or aid arriving too late. These memories shaped local attitudes for years, influencing trust in authority and expectations of charity. In this way, the flood left behind not only physical scars, but social ones, altering the bonds of obligation between rulers and subjects, landlords and tenants, neighbors and kin. The flood also reshaped religious life. Days of fasting and prayer were declared, with communities gathering to ask for protection from future floods. Annual commemorations were held in some parishes, blending grief with gratitude for survival. Relief efforts were often framed in religious terms, as acts of Christian duty, repayment for mercy, or atonement for sin. Thus, charity was not only practical but spiritual, reinforcing the moral order even as disaster had shaken it. For the wider kingdom, the flood served as a test of collective responsibility. It demonstrated the vulnerability of coastal regions, the importance of sea defenses, and the limits of local relief. It also showed the power of print, as pamphlets spread news and stirred sympathy across distances. The flood became a shared event, one that knit together communities through the act of response. Looking back, the relief efforts after the Great Flood of 1607 remind us of the resilience of early modern society. In the absence of modern governments, organized charities, or disaster agencies, people relied on one another, on parish, landlord, church, and neighbor. The relief was patchy, uneven, and often inadequate, yet it made survival possible for thousands. It turned despair into endurance, ruin into rebuilding. Thus, the story of responses and relief is not only about aid, but about the strength of human bonds in the face of calamity. It is about neighbors who opened doors, strangers who gave coins, and communities who rebuilt together. It is about the ways in which society, fragile though it was, found resilience in generosity. And it is this resilience, as much as the flood itself, that deserves to be remembered. The Great Flood of 1607 was not only an event of days, it became a memory of centuries. For those who survived, it remained a wound, spoken of with hushed voices long after waters had receded. For their children and grandchildren, it became a story, shaping how they saw the sea, the land, and the fragile line between them. And for later generations, it became a lesson, a reminder that nature could undo in hours what humans had built over lifetimes. The long-term legacy of the flood can be traced first in the land itself. Fields drowned by salt water required years to recover. In some areas, fertility never returned, leading families to abandon farms altogether. Dikes and embankments were rebuilt higher and stronger, reshaping the very contours of the landscape. Villages shifted slightly inland, their new cottages marking an unspoken acknowledgement of danger. Thus, the flood permanently altered settlement patterns, leaving behind scars still visible to careful eyes today. Economically, the flood's legacy persisted in cycles of poverty and adaptation. Families who lost livestock struggled for years to rebuild herds. Tenants who could not pay rent slipped into dependency, while landlords consolidated holdings. This altered the social structure of rural communities, increasing inequality but also encouraging resilience. The memory of 1607 became a cautionary tale for farmers, reminding them of the need to store grain securely, to diversify crops, and to prepare for scarcity. In this way, the disaster indirectly fostered new habits of prudence. Culturally, the flood entered folklore and memory. In Somerset, Monmouthshire, and Gloucestershire, it was remembered as the Great Drowning. Families told stories of ancestors swept away or saved by chance. Oral traditions kept alive images of floating barns, drowned cattle, and churches filled with water. These stories served not only as memory, but as warning, passed down to caution against building too close to the sea or ignoring the strength of tides. Even centuries later, echoes of these tales persisted in local traditions, anchoring the flood within community identity. Religiously, the flood's legacy was one of awe and humility. Sermons preached in its aftermath framed it as a divine sign, and these interpretations lingered. Annual days of fasting and remembrance were observed in some parishes. Memorials were inscribed in churches, marking the high water lines as both record and warning. For generations, worshippers entered those buildings and saw the evidence of water carved into stone, a reminder that faith must stand even when walls could not. Politically, the flood influenced attitudes toward responsibility and governance. Though early modern states lacked modern disaster agencies, the national collections organized by the Crown set a precedent. The idea that distant communities should aid one another in times of catastrophe became more firmly established. Later disasters, whether flood, fire, or famine, drew upon this precedent. In this sense, the Great Flood of 1607 was part of the slow evolution of collective responsibility in Britain. The flood also influenced thought about nature and science. For centuries, people debated whether it had been a storm surge, a tidal bore, or even a tsunami. These debates encouraged closer attention to natural phenomena, linking observation with explanation. Though modern science was still young, the flood spurred curiosity, leading future generations to study tides, storms, and coastal geography with greater care. Thus, the disaster became a chapter in the longer story of humanity's attempt to understand the forces that shape our world. The legacy of 1607 lies, too, in its lessons. The first and most obvious is humility, the recognition that human structures, no matter how sturdy, can be undone by nature's power. Dikes, cottages, churches, all fell before the sea. The second lesson is resilience, the knowledge that communities can endure, rebuild, and adapt, even after catastrophe. And the third is memory, the importance of preserving stories and records, so that future generations may learn from past suffering. Modern historians and geographers continue to study the flood, not only for its historical interest, but for what it teaches about vulnerability. In an age when coastal flooding remains a danger, the story of 1607 is more than distant memory. It is a reminder of risks still present. The lowlands of Somerset and South Wales remain exposed to tidal surges, and the lessons of the past continue to guide present planning. Sea walls are built higher, flood defenses stronger, but the memory of 1607 whispers that complete safety is an illusion. For local communities, the legacy endures an identity. The flood is part of the story of who they are, a shared trial that binds past to present. To walk in those counties today is to walk over land that remembers, land that once lay beneath the sea. For historians, the flood is a window into early modern life, revealing how people responded to disaster, how they explained it, and how they rebuilt afterward. In the end, the Great Flood of 1607 is remembered not only for its destruction, but for the lessons it carried. It taught humility before nature, resilience in the face of ruin, and the necessity of memory. Its waters drowned fields, but its legacy endured in minds and communities. To recall it now, centuries later, is to honor the endurance of those who lived through it, and to remind ourselves that history is not only kings and battles, but floods and survival. The Great Flood of 1607, like many disasters of its age, did not disappear once the waters withdrew. It lingered, first in grief, then in records, and finally in the collective memory of the regions it struck. Over time, the flood became more than an event. It became a story, retold in sermons and ballads, in family tales whispered by firesides, and in the folklore of Somerset, Monmouthshire, and Gloucestershire. To trace its memory is to see how disaster lives on not only in chronicles, but in the imagination of a people. The most immediate layer of memory was written. Parish registers recorded the sudden rise in burials in January 1607, often grouped under stark notes such as "perished in the flood." Pamphlets printed in London circulated accounts of a mighty wall of waters, spreading news far beyond the Bristol Channel. Chroniclers included the flood in their annals, placing it alongside wars, plagues, and famines as one of the great trials of the kingdom. These written records ensured that the flood would not be forgotten by future historians. Yet they also shaped memory in a particular way, framing the flood as both divine warning and national calamity. But written words were not the only carriers of memory. Oral tradition preserved details that official records ignored. In villages, elders told children of the day when the sea rose without storm, when cattle were carried away, and when families clung to church towers for safety. Some stories emphasized miracles, babies saved from floating cradles, or survivors found alive after days adrift. Others dwelled on horror, fields strewn with drowned sheep, or barns collapsing on families. These tales were repeated for generations, becoming part of local folklore. Folklore often blended fact with imagination. In Somerset, tales arose of ghostly bells tolling under the sea, said to be the sunken churches of drowned villages. In Monmouthshire, some spoke of phantom processions seen on misty mornings, thought to be the spirits of those lost in the flood. Whether believed literally or not, such stories reflected the deep mark the flood had left on the cultural landscape. They gave voice to grief, transforming loss into legend. Ballads and songs also carried the memory. Printed broadsides told of the Great Drowning, their verses simple enough to be sung aloud in taverns and marketplaces. These songs spread the memory beyond the flooded counties, allowing people who had never seen the Severn or the Bristol Channel to share in the story. Music gave shape to sorrow, turning catastrophe into rhyme and rhythm that could be remembered long after prose pamphlets were forgotten. Sermons ensured that memory remained moral as well as historical. Preachers used the flood as an example of divine power, reminding congregations that repentance was necessary to avoid further judgment. Annual days of fasting and prayer were held in some parishes, keeping alive the memory of 1607 as a moment of warning. For communities already steeped in a worldview that saw God's hand in natural events, the flood was not merely history, but theology. Material traces reinforced memory, too. In certain churches, water lines left by the flood were preserved, dark stains on stone that parishioners could see for generations. Some churches carved inscriptions to mark how high the waters had risen. These physical reminders made the flood part of sacred space, ensuring that each new generation who entered those buildings would be confronted with the evidence of nature's force that in family memory. The flood became a reference point. Survivors told children and grandchildren how they had endured. Inheritance patterns, altered by the deaths of heirs, carried the flood's effects into legal records and family lore alike. Some families preserved objects, clocks, books, or tools that had survived the flood, imbuing them with meaning as relics of endurance. In this way, memory was not abstract but tangible, tied to possessions, land, and kinship. Over centuries, the flood's place in history and folklore shifted. By the 18th century, it was remembered less as divine punishment and more as extraordinary natural disaster. In the 19th century, antiquarians collected stories of the flood, fascinated by its scale and by the folklore that had grown around it. In the 20th, scientists debated whether it might have been a tsunami, giving new shape to an old memory. Each era reinterpreted the flood according to its own concerns. Sin and judgment in the 17th century, curiosity and science in the modern. Yet folklore has often proven more enduring than science. Even today, in some coastal communities, the Great Flood is recalled in local lore as the time when the sea came inland. Tour guides tell visitors of drowned fields. Villagers repeat stories of floating barns. And local histories highlight the catastrophe as a defining moment. In this way, the flood continues to live as story as much as fact. The memory of 1607 also influenced how later floods were perceived. When high tides threatened or dikes failed in later centuries, people invoked the Great Drowning as comparison. The flood became a benchmark, the worst-case scenario against which all other floods were measured. Its memory thus shaped expectations, fears, and preparations for generations afterward. Ultimately, the Great Flood of 1607 demonstrates how history and folklore intertwine. Written records preserve statistics and sermons, while oral tales preserve emotion and imagination. Together, they form a layered memory, one that reveals not only what happened, but what it meant to those who lived and remembered. Thus, the legacy of the flood endures not only in ruined fields or scholarly debates, but in stories of water rising without storm, of families swept away, of bells tolling beneath the sea. And in those stories, the flood continues to live for centuries after the waters themselves have vanished. The Great Flood of 1607 remains one of the most haunting natural disasters in British history. In a single morning, the sea swept across more than 200 square miles of land, drowning fields, homes, and churches, and leaving thousands dead or destitute. Its force was sudden, its impact enduring. Yet what makes it truly unforgettable is not only the destruction it caused, but the way it reshaped memory, community, and identity for the people of Somerset. Monmouthshire and Gloucestershire, the flood was a dividing line. Life was measured in two parts, before the waters came and after. Families rebuilt on salted ground, neighbors mourned the dead, and parishes wrote new records filled with sorrow. For decades afterward, the flood lived in sermons and ballads, in folklore and family tales. It became more than an event. It became a story of warning and resilience. Looking back now, we see in the flood both fragility and strength. Fragility in the ease with which nature overturned human labor, crops lost, livestock drowned, cottages swept away in minutes. Strength in the resilience of survivors, those who shared food, rebuilt embankments, raised new homes, and kept memory alive. In their endurance lies the truest legacy of 1607, not ruin, but the capacity to endure ruin. The lessons remain that human life is always lived close to forces larger than itself, that nature can undo with swiftness what takes years to build, that memory matters, not only for grieving the past, but for preparing the future. The Great Flood stands as a reminder that history is not only made by kings and parliaments, but by waters, winds, and the quiet resilience of ordinary people. Tonight, as we close this calm journey into the past, remember those who stood on church towers, who clung to rafters, who carried children through icy waters. Their story reaches across 4 centuries to remind us of both vulnerability and survival. Thank you for joining Boring History for Sleep. If you found this story soothing and meaningful, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can return again for more gentle journeys into the hidden corners of history. Good night.